In the mid-20th century, post-World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union competed to be the biggest world power in the conflict known as the Cold War. Throughout the Cold War, there were numerous conflicts, but one of the most notable is the space race, where both sides competed to prove the superiority of its technology. During the majority of the space race, the Soviet Union remained in the lead until three African-American women, Katherine Johnson, Mary Jackson, and Dorothy Vaughan, helped the U.S. reclaim its place in the race. Despite the restrictive expectations for gender and race during the 20th century, these three African-American women, known as the Hidden Figures, broke through social restraints by inspiring the expansion of professional opportunities for minorities, helping to further progress NASA in the space race against the Soviet Union, and influencing women today to strive for greater roles in society. Hidden Figures, breaking through the barriers of social constraints. After fighting together during World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union developed tensions concerning political and economic affairs. One of these issues concerned the Soviet Union's efforts to spread communism and their global power. This causes Harry Truman to issue his famous Truman Doctrine. I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. The responsibility of supporting third world countries and the addition of many other disagreements with the Soviet Union led to a power struggle resulting in the Cold War. However, unlike other wars, the Cold War consisted of limited use of weapons and combat. Therefore, in order to exemplify their dominance in the world, each aimed to advance their technological abilities, such as seen in their efforts in what is known as the race to space. After President John F. Kennedy made the claim that the U.S. would land a man on the moon before the end of the decade, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, began working to achieve this goal.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Now, let's take a step back to an earlier time. In 1896, the Supreme Court's decision in the case of Plessy v. Ferguson declared the constitutionality of racial segregation laws under the doctrine separate but equal. This allowed the Jim Crow laws, which enforced segregation, to exist throughout the country. As these laws oppressed African Americans and racism continued to exist, many began to fight back against the racial injustice. The fights towards social equality revealed some success in 1941 with the passing of the Executive Order 8802 by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, which prohibited ethnic or racial discrimination in hiring for federal or war-related work. I do hereby reaffirm the policy of the United States that there shall be no discrimination in the employment of workers in defense industries or government because of race, creed, color, or national origin. This cleared the way for the black computers to make their way into NASA history. In 1954, America began making greater strides toward desegregation with the victory in the Supreme Court case of Brown v. Board of Education, which outlawed segregation in public schools. Even with greater attempts to desegregate, many still struggled to break into previously white, male-dominated professions. Katherine Johnson, Mary Jackson, and Dorothy Vaughan, three African-American women, were hired as human computers for NASA despite their ability to achieve more in a higher position. Because of their race and gender, these three, along with many others, were not initially able to live up to their potential. However, these women scraped and clawed to make their way closer to the top and helped successfully launch the first man into space. Despite persevering against the nation's discouragement and making great advancements for NASA and the U.S., these women's stories were buried beneath the accomplishments of white men as a result of racism and gender inequality of the time. Human computers assistance in aeronautics dates back to before the space race, back into the late 19th century. They were first introduced at the Harvard College Observatory when a group of women were employed to collect, study, and catalog thousands of images of stars on glass plates. These women were just as capable as men, however they were placed under less favorable conditions, given long and tedious work, and still expected to uphold societal expectations of being a good wife and mother. In 1935, the NACA, National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, a precursor to NASA, hired 5 women to be their first computer pool at the Langley campus. These women experienced the same conditions as they did in the Harvard Observatory. Women were desirable for this profession not only because they were meticulous and accurate, but also because they worked for less pay. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, which brought the U.S. into the throes of war, NACA and Langley began recruiting African American women with college degrees to work as human computers. The African American women in this profession did the same amount of work as their white counterparts, however they were paid less and dismissed to a segregated west wing of campus. Katherine Johnson, Mary Jackson, and Dorothy Vaughan were 3 women who experienced segregation and discrimination within the field of human computers at NASA. Katherine Johnson, the main protagonist of the Hidden Figures story, graduated from high school at age 14 from West Virginia State University at age 18 and was hired by NASA in 1953. Her first major assignment was computing the trajectories for Alan Shepard's historic flight in 1961, where Johnson was to trace out in extreme detail Freedom 7's path from liftoff to splashdown. This event began the drive to accomplish the most important event in the career of Katherine Johnson at NASA and one of NASA's most crucial successes, America's first complete orbital mission. Johnson's main job during this mission was to double-check and reverse engineer the newly installed IBM 7090's trajectory calculations. John Glenn, the astronaut to be sent into space to complete the lunar orbit, did not trust the calculations of the IBM and insisted Johnson check them because he trusted her more than the machine. Get the girl to check the numbers. If she says the numbers are good, I'm ready to go. Despite her impressive educational history and the importance of her role at NASA, Johnson was left out of many meetings discussing the trajectory calculations due to discrimination of her race and gender. However, she continued to push her way into these meetings, creating a place for African Americans and women in higher positions. Much like Katherine Johnson's exceptional academic career, Mary Jackson graduated with a dual bachelor's degree in mathematics and physical sciences from Hampton Institute. When she was hired at NASA in 1951, she was ecstatic but soon learned that it was not as perfect as it seemed. Jackson faced extreme segregation and after a few months decided she could not handle the separate but equal accommodations at NASA. Before resigning, a supervisor offered her a job as an aeronautical engineer and encouraged her to take engineering classes. Because of this, Jackson became the first black female engineer at NASA. She continued working with wind tunnels, analyzing data on aircraft flight experiments, and giving back to her community until her death in 2005. The last, but certainly not least included in the trio was Dorothy Vaughan. For 11 years, Vaughan split her time between being a mother and her career as a mathematics teacher. In 1943, she was hired at NACA at what she thought would be a temporary job. As she continued to excel at being a human computer, she was eventually promoted to the manager of the West Area Computers, becoming the first black female supervisor at NASA. She was a dedicated advocate for female employees and led the West Area Computers for a decade. In 1958, when NASA desegregated, Vaughan was hired as an expert Fortran programmer and worked on the Scout, Solid Controlled Orbital Utility Test launch vehicle program. She eventually retired in 1971 and passed away in 2008. Johnson, Jackson, and Vaughan were able to overcome the restrictive social normalities of the time by pushing past their expected role in their profession despite the extreme discrimination they faced. They broke the barriers of the traditional belief that women and minorities were inferior to white males. While the Hidden Figures story revolves around Katherine Johnson, Mary Jackson, and Dorothy Vaughan, in reality their story portrays the professional experiences of hundreds of black women in history. Their story just happened to be the one told. These women were able to redefine the concept of racial and gender roles through their perseverance despite the boundaries that restricted them from showing their true potential. Today, women now are receiving higher paying professions as well as more opportunities to obtain these greater roles in society. Although there have been improvements, women still continue to struggle to be seen and treated as equal individuals alongside their male counterparts. Women, however, are not the only ones still seeking to overcome restrictive social barriers. African Americans still continue to fight for equality as well. Although the Hidden Figures were able to significantly change society's outlook on how women and African Americans are perceived, the fight for justice still remains prevalent today.